Configuring your solution in SAP. In this video, we will share our lessons learned and best practices on how to successfully get your proposed design configured in SAP, as well as how to control and manage the progress. The video is divided into the following topics: after the business blueprint design, the configuration process, controlling the process, and finally configuration and development configuration. So let's have a look at after the business blueprint design first. So the business blueprint design phase has been completed, and we are now in the realization phase, and we need to start configuring the solution. So with the business blueprint design phase completed means that the business blueprint design document has been completed either fully or partly. So you might have certain areas where you decide to move ahead and start the realization phase while you are finishing up those very minor outstanding areas. But the majority of your design document has to be completed, and it has to be signed off. It can also be that you have signed off, you completed the full document, and you have signed off the full document with some conditions that certain things are corrected or amended or researched further, whatever it might be. But the majority of your design is completed, and you have a signature to accompany that, to document that it has been truly completed and accepted by all stakeholders. And lastly, your RISE F scope is defined and signed off, and the RISE F scope means your ABAP developments that you need to do on top of the standard SAP process. So RISE F stands for Report Interfaces Conversions, Enhancement and Forms. So it's abbreviation of the different types of ABAP developments that you typically add on to your standard SAP process. So with the business blueprint design phase completed, meaning these deliverables completed, what's next? Well, firstly, we need to prepare and start our ABAP development or our RISE F development. And to do that, we need to establish our development team. It can either be an internal team or it can be an external vendor that we are going to contract to do this work, in which case we need to go into a vendor selection process. And we will have much more about vendor selection in the last course of the training we provide. We also need to plan and start our development. And once the development is initiated, we need to complete the system build and infrastructure set up to both support the development but also the system itself. And for this, we need to make sure we have at least the development, the QA, quality assurance, the training systems ready, plus any supporting infrastructure that you might need. And this could be email gateways, it could be scanning solutions, it could be archiving solutions, whatever other infrastructure that is closely linked with SAP. Then thirdly, we need to prepare and start our SAP process configuration. This is where we are configuring the SAP processes, meaning we're customizing SAP within the standard framework to support our design. And this encompasses of the configuration itself, unit testing, and then finally documentation. Number 4, we need to start our test preparation. So during the realization phase, we have 2 tests that commonly are executed, which we need to start planning and preparation for. That is the system integration test, abbreviated SIT, and the user acceptance test, abbreviated UAT. Now we will in later lessons explain much more about the testing and how you get your solution proper tested. We also, as part of the realization phase or after the business blueprint, need to start our training preparation. And again, like the test, we have 2 common training activities that is normally taking place. One is train the trainer. This is where the project team train the trainer, and end user training. And again, like the testing, we will address the training, how to get your project trainers, end users, all the training needs for a typical SAP implementation. We will discuss that in a separate lesson in much more detail. This is the task that needs to start after the business blueprint design has been signed off. So let's try and put this on the timeline, where we here on the top have the realization phase. This is the activities that is needed in the realization phase. And if we start looking at the inputs, we have the business process master list document, which we produced during the business blueprint phase. We have the design itself documented in the blueprint design document, and we have the development scope. So this is the input and to the realization phase, and the major processes or activities in the realization phase are: the development system are ready, configuration and development is going to be planned, prepared, completed, and tested in the unit test, and then it will be transported to QA, quality assurance, for the subsequent testing and training. So let's have a bit, or before we have a look at the actual milestone and deliverables, there is an error that appears here, and that is because the realization phase configuration process. Now the error continues here. We have more to come. So you will note that the integration test that I mentioned before is not here. It comes here out here in the future. But during this configuration process, where we go to the unit test and we transport to QA, we will have an interaction back. So once we unit test it and we transport it to QA and we verify it here, this is all part of the configuration and development team verification that the configuration and development are done and correctly completed. There might be bugs, there might be findings from the test that causes an error or a feedback here back to the configuration, and you then need to develop some corrections, or you need to correct configuration, and then you go through again unit test, transport to QA, you validate it in the QA system, and if it's fine, then you can sign off the development. So that's why this error is going back, or this process where you go back to the configuration and development. So it's an interaction or iterative process, and how many times you go around here, it really depends on the quality and the quality process you have in place, which we will explain to you later how to control your configuration and development. So let's look at some of the milestones and deliverables. So the input or the activity in order for you to start your development and configuration also is that, of course, you need to have the development system ready, and during the technical team establish the development system, you need to, for all the development scope, you need to write the functional development specifications. This is the functional team explaining or putting the requirements on in writing, so that development guys or the development team can pick that up and start the coding. And again, of course, you cannot start the configuration development before you have the development team established, and it comes back to the vendor selection. You also need unit test scripts to be developed. You see this starts a little later. It's typically something that's done through as you go through the configuration. You have certain synergies that you can, once you do the configuration, you can prepare the script at the same time. Then also during the configuration and development, you will produce the technical documentation accompanying the ABAP or the RISE-F development, and that goes the same for the functional teams who's doing the configuration. They will document the configuration in the configuration notes, which is the term for that document that will later on be your documentation for what configuration have been set up. So this is normally happening as you do your actual configuration in the system and the development by the development teams. Then you go into unit testing, and during the unit test you will have your unit test result. And with that, you now have a system configured with the developments in it, that is ready in the QA system, it's transported to the QA system, and it's ready for your system integration test. So this is the configuration process part of the realization phase. So let's have a look at how we're going to control that process as we go through here. Just like any other phase, this is a critical phase in the project. It's probably, as you were scrambling in the business blueprint phase to get the design ready, all the requirements, get the sign off in the, depending on what your design encompasses of, in the realization phase during the configuration and development process, you will really need to get whatever you design built. So this is probably, I would say, the most busy part of the project in workload wise. So the first step is development system ready, and here we need the technical teams to design the system landscape and, as it says here, communicate this to all stakeholders, or especially the project team, because you need to make sure everyone knows what part of your system landscape is to be used for what. And we will later on in later lessons in this course go into more, take a deep dive into more details about the system landscape. Then we need development user profiles to be set up for all SAP functional members and development teams. So basically the user profiles that allows the functional and development team to do the configuration and development, as well as transport it through to the system where they'll need to do the unit test. So this is the task for the technical teams. And it's easily measured, the development system readiness, because is the system there or is it not? Whereas the configuration and development is a little bit more difficult to track. But what we need to do is we need to have control that are we on track getting the different components developed, the different development, the individual development developed and tested or ready for testing. That means report, conversion, interfaces, and so on. And what about the individual configurations that needs to be set up in the SAP system? And this can be broken down into tracking sheets, which is my preferred way of doing this. So you have a tracking sheet, you have clear ownership, and you will have a daily reporting of the progress. You have one common issue log where everything is, any issues experienced across development and configuration teams are recorded and tracked and can be monitored. Unit testing, again, I prefer making use of a tracking sheet. So you have a tracking sheet which will allow you to track both the completion of the unit test script itself, but also the execution of the test, as well as the documentation of the test, and if there's any outstanding problems raised, you have daily reporting of both the progress and the issues, as the issues are recorded in the test log. So we will take a deep dive into the testing in later lessons, and we'll go through how this tracking sheet can be established, as well as we will have some material for you for download, and the same goes for the tracking sheet for the configuration. Last part, transport to QA. So here a few important notes. You need to make sure you document the transport IDs. It might be a very simple task and it can sound very basic. Nevertheless, it's something that's often a subject for great confusion and delays and frustration, because at one point you need to know exactly what is the transport that belongs to what configuration, what team, what development. And for this you really need to make sure that the technical teams complete the transport strategy for your project, and that transport strategy needs to be endorsed by everyone so that everyone adhere to it 100%. Otherwise you will have a mess. I've seen that on projects when you later on get to the production deployment. And then also important is the basis team often just pass through the transport to whatever system it is it's requested to flow to, but there needs to be follow up on the result of the individual transports. There needs to be a verification. Has the transport gone good or bad? What is the status inside the SAP transport tool? As well as you need to verify that this even though the tool says it's okay, does it work? Because it might be some transports get out of sequence, or a piece of the puzzle is missing. So you need to do a verification and not just rely on the SAP tool. But for sure, if the SAP transport tool tells you that there is a potential issue or there is an error, then of course, needless to say, those items need to be followed up swiftly. Also, a good advice here is to make sure that you have clear roles and responsibility, who's doing the transport to what systems, and limit the access so that you don't suddenly have unauthorized or unknown transport flowing into your system, and then later on when you do the production deployment, you find out that the production system doesn't work as it does in the QA system because some transport has been overlooked or has been not consistently moved through the system landscape. We'll get into the transport procedure and the system landscape when we get to the that specific lesson. So that's the process and the controlling of the process. Then let's have a look at the documentation that needs to be produced accompanying the configuration and development work. So first of all, we need the technical documentation for the development. So we need functional and technical specifications for all RISE-F developments. We need configuration notes for all the functional configuration. We need unit test scripts plus the result recorded and documented. And again, some good advice here. Remember to get sign off to all these specification and test documents. If you produce the documents and you upload it and you don't get commitment through a sign-off process, the documentation is not, how do you say, it will not be recognized as the record you need later on if there's a dispute, or if you need to go back and you need to use the documentation as a reference. Because then someone will most likely say, I've never signed off for this, or I don't agree with it. So make sure you get a sign off, make sure you have proper change control of your documents. The word is change control, enforce that throughout your team. It can sound trivia and it can sound like a unnecessary step, but it will help you avoid a lot of problems later on if you get into a situation where suddenly you need a scope change to your design or your development, and you will then have to refer back to the documentation. Here it is important that everyone knows who have been involved in preparing the documentation, reviewing it and signing it off. And don't forget that you also need to have an authorization matrix. So now you start to have systems and you start to have users accessing your systems. So a part of this is also that you have clear documentation of who have access to what, including data structure. So the documentation has to include the access, consideration and solution, as well as the data structure that from the blueprint design will be put in place in very much detail, so that there is no question about how the data structure design has been configured and why it is as it is. And one note here is that this documentation, you will have people in your team that might be reading this or might insist to review it or sign it off. You need to enforce and you need to stay firm on this, that the target audience of these documentation must be expected to understand SAP. They must have SAP knowledge, otherwise this will not work. If you're writing these documents for non-SAP skilled people, then your documents gets very comprehensive and you will not have time to do that. So it's technical and functional documentation to be supported or supporting the functional and technical SAP members. With that, let's do a summary. So after completing this video, you should now have a good understanding of some of our lessons learned and best practices on how to successfully get your proposed design configured in SAP, including the developments, and how to control and manage the process, as well as some good advice to how you make sure you document this properly. Any questions, as always, please don't hesitate to contact us through the forum.